Well, welcome to this video talk. Today we're looking at the subject of the human brain. Now, the human brain is the most complicated organ in the human body, but it's also probably the least well understood. There are many aspects about the way the brain works that we don't understand yet. It's not entirely clear why the brain gives rise to consciousness. But despite the fact there's areas of brain physiology we don't understand, there are a lot of areas where we have got some grasp of the subject matter, and it's very important to understand these so we can relate this to neurological disease and to trauma, to head injuries, because head injuries are very common in our accidents and emergency departments, and we need to know how to manage these, and that requires an understanding of the way the brain works and the overall structure of the brain and the central nervous system. Now, we've said the brain is the most complicated organ in the body. It contains 100,000 million nerve cells, or neurons. 100,000 million nerve cells. It's interesting that that's about the same number as there are stars in our galaxy. Around about 100,000 million stars in the galaxy. 100,000 million nerve cells in the human brain. But many organs, of course, are large and contain many amounts of cells, large numbers of cells. So what is it that makes the brain just so complicated? Well, you probably remember that between neurons, between nerve cells, there are physical gaps called synapses. And these synapses are crossed by neurochemicals that transmit nerve impulses across the synaptic gap in one direction. And each neuron in the brain forms synaptic interconnections with between 1,000 and 10,000 other neurons. So you can see there's 100,000 million nerve cells, each with between 1,000 and 10,000 synaptic interconnections. Can you see that gives us an almost infinite amount of possible synaptic interconnections? And it's these interconnections and the functioning of these neurons which gives rise to consciousness and the experience of consciousness, our relationships, and indeed it's these neurons and synapses that give rise to what it is to be human. The biological component of humanity is determined by the brain. So what you are, basically, is the product of your brain function. And it could be argued that all the other organs in the body are there merely to support the brain, because that's what gives you your humanity. That's what makes you special and what makes you unique. Now, before we get down to looking at some really interesting anatomy and physiology about the brain, I just want to discuss the skull in a little detail. The skull contains facial bones in the front and the cranial bones that form the vault of the cranial cavity. So let's just look at a few of these briefly. So we're talking about the skull. Now, the bones of the skull are joined by suture joints. And I've drawn one here. These are a jagged line, so that might be one bone there and another bone there. So you can see that the joint between the bones, the joint is very interconnected. The bones mesh into each other and they're connected with fibrous tissue. And that makes these suture joints very rigid, because the skull is a rigid, closed vault. And the bones I'd like to point out in a minute are the frontal bone, the maxilla, the mandible, the zygomatic bone, the parietal bone, the occipital bone, the temporal bone, and the sphenoid bone. So let's have a look at these bones now on some models of the skull. Now, the first skull I want to show you is actually a neonatal baby skull. We can see the bones in here in this, and we can see the suture lines. And the big difference between the adult and the child skull, the neonatal skull, is the fontanelle, this area of fibrous tissue here, which is not yet covered by bone. So in babies there's a fontanelle there, a largest one at the front, the anterior fontanelle. And then there's another one at the back there, the posterior fontanelle. And we can see the suture lines still joining the bones of the skull, but not well formed at this stage. But when we go on and look at the adult skull, what we find is that the cranial bones, which are these bones here, form a completely closed vault. It is completely closed. Now I know there are some holes at the base of the skull, which we'll look at in a minute. But in life, all these holes at the base of the skull are filled with fibrous tissue, nervous tissue, or blood vessels. So the skull is actually a completely closed vault. And on these models you can open it to look inside. And inside the cranial bones, we have the cranial cavity. So everything within these cranial bones here is the cranial cavity. And this forms a completely closed vault, enclosing the brain and some nerves and the blood vessels, and also some of the spaces occupied by meninges, the protective layers around the brain, and of course the cerebrospinal fluid, which also protects the brain. Now on this coloured model we can see the individual bones of the skull quite clearly, which someone has kindly painted for us. So first of all we can see this light brown bone on the front, and this is the frontal bone. So that's quite a nice easy name to remember, the frontal bone. And then going down here we see the upper jaw bone. This orange bone is the maxilla, and the upper teeth bed into the maxilla. The lower jawbone is the mandible, articulating on the temporomandibular joint. And here we can see the bottom teeth are arising from the mandible. And if we pull this flap of skull down, we can actually see here the way the teeth embed into the bone of the mandible. Now this purple bone here is the zygomatic bone, one of the facial bones, zygomatic bone. And then these large green bones on the side are the parietal bones. And you can see the suture line there between the frontal bone and the parietal bone. So covering a large part of the side of the skull, the parietal bones. Then at the very back here, the very back of the head, light blue on this model, and again you can see the suture lines quite clearly. This light blue bone is the occipital bone. The occipital bone. And then on the side, here, this darker brown bone is the temporal bone. And of course it's the same on the other side. So that is the temporal bone. Now there's other bones you could point out, but I think I'll probably just do one more on this review. This red one here, this red bone is the sphenoid bone. And if we open the skull up, we can see that these bones are continued inside the skull. And we can see that they're continued on the base of the skull here, these bones on the base, with the same colour coding. And then we can see at the bottom, this hole here is called the foramen magnum. Foramen is the word which means window, and magnum just means big, so literally that's the big window. And let's look at this on a real skull. So here we can see the foramen magnum from inside the cranial cavity, and the spinal cord runs up here, and the spinal cord will actually terminate at the level of the foramen magnum, but of course it's completely continuous with the first part of, or the lower part of the brain stem, the medulla oblongata, which is found just where my finger is now. And all of the other small holes in the skull in life are filled up with blood vessels, nerves or fibrous tissue to make this a closed vault. So the spinal cord goes in through the foramen magnum, and interestingly the two vertebral arteries also enter the cranial cavity via the foramen magnum. Now if we look at the base of the skull here, we can see that there's various holes. And you can see I've stuffed a paperclip through one just as an example. So that's going in just there. And this is where the internal carotid artery enters the cranial cavity. And if I turn it round, we can see the paperclip in the cranial cavity there, pointing out the area where the carotid artery, or the internal carotid artery, enters the cranial cavity. Now there are various other small holes. For example, if I put another paperclip through here, through the orbit, so this is going in through the orbital cavity. The orbit, of course, is the cavity where the eyes are found. And so the paperclip, this paperclip now, is representing where the optic nerve would enter the cranial cavity. And there's another small hole just here, also communicating with the orbit, and a branch of the trigeminal nerve goes through that hole in life. Towards the back here, there's some larger holes. We'll put the paperclip through there again. And these are where the jugular veins leave the cranial cavity. And there's various other small holes in the skull where blood vessels enter and leave. For example, just here, that paperclip now is in a small hole. This is where the middle meningeal artery enters the cranial cavity. There's an anterior meningeal artery towards the front and a posterior one towards the back. But the middle meningeal artery is very important. It goes along the inside of the parietal bone. In fact, you can actually, I don't know if you can see it, but I can feel the grooves in the parietal bone where the middle meningeal artery ran in life with its front, anterior and back posterior branches. So the cranial cavity is a closed vault, closed by the bones of the cranial cavity. The bones are rigidly fixed together by the suture-lined joints, and any holes that are in the base of the skull are filled with blood vessels or nerves or fibrous tissue during life. The really clever thing is that all the holes in the skull are in just the right place to allow the vessels to go in and out and the nerves to go in and out. The foramen magnum is in just the right part of the skull at just the right angle to allow the spinal cord to communicate with the medulla oblongata. So it's all a very clever design, really.